Welcome back to One More Mana. My name's Derik, and today we are getting right back into another deck tech. Now, last week I kind of teased a little bit that I wanted to do another land-ish deck that wasn't in green, just a Noyan, and this week is going to be another really interesting strategy that doesn't use green, that cares about lands, and it is a commander I was so excited about. It's somewhat new, and it's just a good time, and it is Moraug, Fury of Akoum. Now, if you want any of the awesome cards in this deck, or just any of the amazing cards coming out recently, I'm super excited personally about Time Spiral Remastered because I am a sucker for old borders. Then head on over to TCG Player. Anything you want you can find on TCG Player. Any of the old borders now, foils. I think they even got little stars back on those foils, so I'm so excited. But yes, head to TCG Player to find them, and if you use the affiliate link down below in the description, you can help support the channel in the process. We really always do appreciate all the help. So let's just get right back into Morag. I kind of want to go over his abilities, and then we'll get into the direction I took the deck. So Moraug is 4 and 2 red, so a 6 mana 6/6, and each time a creature attacks, it gets +1/+0, which is interesting. And then on top of that, where it gets real crazy, is every time a land enters, so you have Landfall at the end of the main phase. If it's your main phase, you get an additional combat step where you untap your creatures and just go to town. Now, the way this stacks out, and I may have done a poor job of explaining that, but what it kind of boils down to is you always want to make your land drops on your second main phase. Because let's just say, if you do in your first main and you play a land, you get that extra combat step right after that main phase. You untap your creatures, which probably don't need to be untapped, swing in, but then when you move to your regular combat phase, they don't untap again. They only untap on these extra combat phases. So how it's going to play out most times is you go to regular combat, second main, you do any landfall shenanigans you can, and then get all those extra combats there. It usually doesn't matter too much, but it does matter for some sequencing. Basically, you're usually going to be able to have the same type of turns. You just want to make sure you do it correctly, or you'll be basically wasting a combat step. So this opens up a lot of possibilities. There's a lot of, no surprise, red creatures that love to attack. You can take this deck a lot of different directions. You can go all in on extra combat steps. You can try to go all in on landfall. You can throw just monsters like a Tali and combat celebrate, all these crazy things. But if y'all know me, I love flavor and I love tribal stuff. So for me, the decision was kind of easy, and I wanted to go goblins. I always want to go goblins, try to throw goblins at any deck I can. And I went full on goblin tribal. Now, it's not just because I'm flavorful, and it's not just because I think goblins are awesome. It's also because I think Moraug kind of low-key is amazing as a goblin commander. The Anthem effect of Moraug really kind of lends itself towards tokens. It's basically just free +1/+0 for all your tokens, just for regular combat. And the fact that if you get into a situation where you get 20 goblins out, which in goblin decks isn't hard, and you get to 2-3 combats, that is just game over. It's essentially almost like having a weird coat of arms-ish, not quite as good, but a weird coat of arms type effect. It reminds me a lot of playing Martin Stromgold as a goblin commander, where you have this finisher in the command zone. It's kind of just a different version of it, and I'm super excited. Also, in like my own little headcanon, Moraug's just like wandering around Zendikar, lost, alone, sad, and lonely Tauros man, and just finds this goblin army that he befriends and goes on blowing things up and attacking things. And that's how it is in my head, and that's how this deck is going to play out. It's just going to be so much fun. We are just swinging everywhere with our goblin army with Moraug at the head of it, and we're trying to burn stuff down. So let's jump into the creatures to start. And with these creatures, it's not going to be any surprise. We are all in on goblins. We got goblins everywhere, and it's going to be pretty similar, again, to most goblin decks. Not a ton of surprises in the creature slot, but I will still point out, for the most part in goblins, again, just play all the goblins you want. And the cool thing is about it is, as long as they have, low CMC, or they get other goblins out, which is basically all of them, it's going to get you into your strategy. But there are a few that I feel like you just need in here that really do help get your strategy going. And it's going to be haste enablers like Goblin Chieftain and Goblin War Chief. They're just so good. It really feels bad not to have them in there, and those haste effects are huge. I love Muxus. Muxus by itself is an awesome commander, but I really like Muxus in here because it can go ahead, help us get a bunch of goblins out and really set up these big attack steps. Not to mention, Muxus himself is terrifying when he starts swinging with all these goblins out with all these extra combat steps. And to zero surprise, the two probably best creatures in the deck are going to be the two Krenkos. OG Krenko is just absolutely insane as a goblin commander, and in the 99 is just as scary And because our commander allows us to untap during these extra combats, yeah, Krenko's going to win you a lot of games if you can get it out with these extra combat steps, especially when you get haste enablers and all these tokens can just keep swinging and swinging. But even new Krenko kind of does something similar because of the fact that every time it attacks, the pump that you're getting from your commander just results in more goblins being pooped out, and stuff gets crazy. These are just such fun cards, but you get so much flexibility. I love running just something like a Brash Taunter that kind of doesn't necessarily care about other goblins, but is just this indestructible thing that you can swing around with and do cool shenanigans. It's great to have utility goblins in this deck as well, because at one point, once you get enough out, you don't really care what the individual goblins do. You're getting these pump effects and you have lots of token creators, but it's cool to do little fun stuff. So Goblin Snowman, Brash Taunter, whatever your pet goblins are, this is a great deck to throw them in. Now looking at the enchantments, there's some just the most important cards in this deck. It's no surprise we're in Goblin, so Goblin Bombardment and Impact Tremors and Mana Echoes, that type of stuff, Shared Animosity. These cards are staples in Goblin decks, and for a reason, they're so good. But there are a couple things I kind of tweaked in this deck as opposed to older Goblin decks that you might have seen me deck tech in the past. I've actually gone away from Ogre Battle Driver and instead jumped over to In the Web of War. It's 1 CMC higher, or 1 mana value, I think is what they call it now. Whatever it is, the mana cost is slightly higher, but having it on an enchantment I think is huge. This deck is so delicate to board wipes, and having one of these important haste buff effects on a creature makes it even more so. I really like moving this over to an enchantment. And the coolest enchantment in this deck, I think, is going to be Valakut Exploration, because it kind of goes in with that Landfall thing. And we're going to get into, in a second, how we're going to try to get Landfall triggers, because I haven't talked about that too much yet. But even just hitting land drops, it gives us a little bit of card advantage, and there are some certain turns where we might be able to snowball that a little bit. And in a Goblin deck, any bit of card advantage we can get will help tremendously. In the artifacts, we just want tons of ramp. Now, obviously, Wayfarer's Bauble is the best ramp card for this deck because it actually gets us a land. So this is the type of thing where we can just let it sit on the board and use it late game to just go ahead and get an extra combat step because we get the extra land into play. So that's kind of the ideal thing. But we just want lots of mana rocks. Now, if you look at my deck list, I do have Mana Crypt and Mana Vault. I think even a Grim Monolith in there. I don't know. Either way, don't worry about those. Those are not important. Just throw whatever mana rocks you have in. Yeah, Mana Crypt is great, but if you just run a bunch of mana rocks, you're gonna be fine. This deck is not, yeah, you can get like the Dream Hand and all of a sudden Mana Crypt into this and this and get a whole bunch of stuff out. That doesn't happen very often, even with that in the deck. So just run whatever budget mana rocks you have, and as long as you just put a ton of mana rocks in there, you'll be just fine. There's tons of alternatives at this point, so I wouldn't worry too much. Don't stress on the expensive mana rocks. Really, you know, Wayfarer's Bauble's probably the most important ramp card in here, and your Soul Rings and everything else will fill in just fine. I do really love Vanquisher's Banner and Heraldic Banner. These are super good. I mean, Heraldic Banner is great because it is a mana rock, but getting these extra Anthem of pump effects, they add up so fast, and considering our commander is already giving us these pumps, all of a sudden it turns this Goblin army that we need to kill everybody down from like 30 or 40 to 10 or 15, and just having these out, they stack up. One ramps us, one's drawing us cards. These things can really pile up, and some Goblin decks actually don't run a ton of effects like this because they're more combo based. This one we want to attack, so these Anthem effects become much more effective. In the sorceries, I'm really running whatever wheel effects I can, so I am running Wheel of Misfortune, Reforge the Soul, and Wheel of Fortune. Again, Wheel of Fortune is way too expensive. If you don't have one, don't worry about that, obviously. Wheel of Misfortune though and Reforge the Soul are really good. I love wheel effects in mono red just because so many times, especially in my Goblin decks, I feel like I have no cards in hand and everyone else has cards. So I do like throwing these in. So even just to Reforge the Soul, if Wheel of Misfortune, because Wheel of Misfortune, side rant, love the card. It is so damn confusing. Every time I do it, I feel like I understand it. Then I start trying to explain it, and I don't know what I just said, and nobody else does either. So I feel like if you have frustrations with the ruling on that, totally get it. But at least Reforge the Soul, and if you feel more comfortable with Wheel of Misfortune, throw that in there as well. I love it. Even a Wheel of Fate, which typically I don't really like in a lot of decks. That's the type of card where maybe early in the game you put a Wheel of Fate, suspend it, because you know you're going to be playing out so many goblins out of your hand that even if you have a handful of cards when you suspend the Wheel of Fate, probably by the time it goes off you won't, because you're a mono red goblin. So whatever wheel effects you can get do help. But my favorite sorcery in here is Nahiri's Lithoforming. This card is so much fun. Super risky because you're just having to sack a bunch of lands in a red deck that really doesn't have a lot of ways to get them back. This is kind of an all-in thing, and I'm kind of terrified to cast it, but for flavor purposes, it just felt like it fit the deck, so I wanted to try it. And this is going to be the type of deal where you think you can go ahead and win. Second main, you got a bunch of creatures on board, you're going all in, sacking all your lands, and if hoping you hit a few land drops to then go ahead, drop those, and finish everybody off. Super high risk, But I think that's kind of the whole fun and very on flavor with playing goblins. It's just all in, and if it doesn't work, it just doesn't work. With the instance, there's really just the normal red interaction, but I do really love Tybalt's Trickery. This card, I mentioned it in my favorite Kaldheim cards. It just seems like so much fun. I know there's tons of ways to break it, but I honestly just love using it as a mono red counterspell. It seems like a super good time, and the chaos that ensue just again fits in with the mono red goblin theme. Valakut Awakening, though, I think is the best instant in here. The fact that it doubles as a land, so we can get that landfall trigger if we do need one. And the fact that it lets us recycle our hand. I keep talking about it, but card selection and card advantage is really tough to get by in mono red, and this doesn't exactly give us card advantage, but it does help us make sure we can get the cards we need, especially if we even just need an extra land drop late game. This will help us get there, and acts as a land. It's just super good. I'm putting this in basically every red deck now. I really love this card. Now with the lands, this land base is actually really interesting. I decided to put whatever fetches I could get in this deck, and most of them aren't the expensive kind. It's just, you know, Terramorphic Expanse, Evolving Wilds, Fabled Passage. Unfortunately, Prismatic Vista is now expensive. Myriad Landscape, basically everything. I think I'll probably try to put like 7 or 8 lands that sack themselves to get other lands in. And if you happen to have the fancy fetch lands, great. That's not really important. And Evolving Wilds really does everything we need it to do, because that's those 2 landfall triggers. You know, Myriad Landscape is crazy because it also can ramp us early game and can get us those 2 landfall triggers late. It's a lot of what we want. I did kind of go in an interesting route where I did split my snows and regular mountains in the hope of getting a Field of the Dead go off at some point. Doesn't seem like a very good strategy in this deck, but it seems fun, and I love Field of the Dead, so we're going to try that as well. It's a bunch of fun little things that I do in all my other lands deck. It's not going to be as efficient in here, but why not try to have a good time and see if you can get this stuff to work in red. It's going to be hard, but the times it does work, I think it's going to be super fun. I particularly love the flexibility of Ghost Quarter, because it's not only acting as single target removal for your opponent's lands, but you can just do it to one of your own lands and get another landfall trigger as well. So that is awesome. I almost counted that as one of the fetch lands in my deck for that reason, because we can go ahead. This is kind of an all-in deck. There are going to be turns where we are sacking our own land, doing some crazy stuff that sets us back in the hope of getting that explosive turn to finish people off. One card I really love in here that I've had for forever and could never find a home for is Undiscovered Paradise. It's super risky because basically every turn it just bounces back to your hand, but it guarantees you a land drop every turn. Now this is your like second or third land, no bueno, but getting this late game and making sure you can hit a land drop every turn to get that landfall trigger, again, we're finding weird ways to get creative with our lands. Now you can go and play Alpine Guides and Cleansing Wildfires, and these are all cards I have kind of off to the side in this deck. But because it's so heavy in Goblin Tribal, I didn't go all in on landfall effects. Really in this deck, typically when you get a Goblin board, 1 or 2 extra combats all you need. If you find that these extra combats aren't happening frequently enough, or you feel like you need to chain them more, run those Cleansing Wildfires, run those Alpine Guides, run other cards to get more landfall effects. But I do think kind of the minimal package that we have with the Evolving Wilds and all these fetch lands is going to be enough to kind of get us where we need to go. Because I mean, goblins honestly didn't need that much help to begin with, so I don't think we need to go all in at the cost of some of our other goblin tribal pieces. All right, so that is going to do it for all the categories. Now let's get into the best part of every deck tech. And in goblins decks, you always know it's the most explosive part, and that is the game-winning step. How are we about to win the game with this deck? Now, I will kind of put a disclaimer. When you look at the deck list, and it was even more so when it started, initially I basically took my Krenko deck and just switched the commander and wanted to see what the hell happened. I had no idea how it was going to go. And to me, the craziest thing was how different it played out with no changes initially. The thought process and the decision making was so different from how I played Krenko, despite the fact that so many pieces were the same, that it felt like a totally different deck. And especially now changing some of these with the Nahiri's Lithoforming and changing the whole mana base and having some of these cards that kind of switch up the thought process, it really feels different. So even if you're someone who's already played Goblin decks and maybe you didn't think it was for you, it has a different feel to it, and it may actually bring you into the Goblin family if you haven't already been so before. So I do think it's worth giving a shot, even if you don't like Goblin decks in the past. Having said that though, it's kind of the same way we're going to win in Goblin decks. Now, the means we get there is different, but it's that same 1-2 punch. And that first way is always going to be through just raw combat damage, trying to punch people. And that's through the effects we've talked about with Muxus and the Krenkos. And just getting a bunch of goblins out, turning sideways and punching people in the face. And our commander is the best facilitator for that. We get the Anthem effect right away. The land drops give us these extra combat steps, and we can just punch people in the face. Now, for the second way to win the game, let's just say you're in that game where, you know what, combat damage isn't working. You can attack. There's propaganda's out. What are we going to do? And that's where we get the ETB, XTB, exploding goblins to kill everyone. And that's with the Perforoses of the world, Impact Tremors, Goblin Bombardment, Pashalik Mons. All these super awesome cards that basically say that, okay, we can't kill you through combat, well, all these goblins are still going to poop on you regardless. You have no way to get out of it. These effects are so important, and I do actually find myself with Krenko, I found myself almost exclusively winning through these type of effects. Rarely did I feel like I won through combat. In my experience with this deck, you very much win with combat more often. These are kind of backups as opposed to the primary way to win, but they're still great to have, especially if you get taxed out of your commander or anything like that. You always want these, and in a goblin deck, they're staples for a reason. They can make sure that you can get that extra damage through if you just ever need that push, because maybe you got some combat early, commander gets taxed out, this will kind of get you there late game. And then the last way to win the game, there's going to be games, if for anybody who plays goblins knows, there's times where, you know what, you get board wiped a couple times, your commander gets taxed out, you just can't keep a presence on board, you got like 2 or 3 1/1s, nothing's looking scary, everyone's staring at you because you're playing goblins, so they still want to kill you, and you just feel hopeless. And that's where a card like this comes in. It is one of the most classic red cards in Commander, and sometimes I just play it for the nostalgia kick, and it is Insurrection. I love this card so much. I just remember when I first started playing, this was kind of like the boogeyman of the format. This was like, oh, if they play this, like stuff is going down. And now I don't really see it anymore. I mentioned it a couple times in deck text, but I love it just as much as I always did. And I do think mono red is a great place for it, because there's going to be times where you run at a card advantage. There's going to be times where your board gets wiped and you kind of get screwed in that sense. This is still, no matter how many times I've played it, it's still such a fun way to win, where everything seems hopeless. All hope is lost. You drop this, steal everyone's creatures, punch them with them, and just enjoy the aftermath. And it's just, to me, it's still all flavor. This deck is all about doing what red wants to do, and I think this card just encapsulates red better than really any other card I could think of. And that is going to do it for this week's deck tech. I really hope y'all enjoyed it. This is, I've said it a million times, this is such a fun deck. I do think that if you're looking for that right goblin tribal commander, maybe Krenko seems a little too scary, maybe Muxus is not your thing, take a look at Moraug. This is such a fun deck, and there's so many cool little techs you can throw in with weird ways to get landfall triggers that it really lets you get creative, even if it's only a few slots in the deck. Really get your brain going and try to find weird ways to get those extra combat steps in. If y'all have any of your favorite non-goblin commanders, definitely let me know. Or if you have any awesome builds of Moraug yourself, definitely throw them down in the comments. And as always, of course, a huge shout out and thank you to all the patrons. We love and appreciate y'all so much. And there are lots of things scheming up right now. I will say, definitely make sure, if you haven't already, come check out our weekly Commander stream, Commander Petty, every Saturday at 8:30. We got a whole petty point system that we are in the process of implementing that you'll be seeing soon. So definitely come by. It is always a good time. But yeah, I mentioned Time Spiral. There's going to be a video coming out about that at some point, I think. Don't know when, but oh my gosh, those old borders are beautiful. I'm going to go stare at those for a while. Yeah, I'll be back at some point, but I'm going to go look at some old borders. Until then, I will see y'all next time.